Welcome to IVF This, episode 48, Infertility Burnout. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today. I am starting to feel better. I'm sure you know that I took a little bit of time off. Thank you, everyone who sent me sweet messages, emails, wishing me well. It really did mean a lot to me. And so I might have taken a couple of weeks off from podcasting, but I didn't take any time off from thinking about you all. So we've got a lot of really fun things coming up. We've got a 2-part episode on infertility burnout. This is the first one. I've got an interview that I'm going to do with my best friend where we talk about infertility and how it impacts relationships and friendships. I'm going to be talking about anxiety and control. I have another interview with one of my former clients coming up as well. And then pretty soon we're going to be celebrating 1 year of the IVF This podcast, which is insane to me that we've done this for a year. And the amount this podcast has grown, the amount of reach this podcast has had over the last year is, it's indescribably phenomenal. It's the only way I can put it. The impact that it's had in just such a short amount of time is entirely based on you guys, right? I sit here, I do my thing, I talk into the microphone, but you guys are the ones out there telling other people about it. And you guys are the one who are taking the information that I share and you're applying it to your everyday life so that for even just a little bit of time in specific moments, you are creating less suffering, right? You are eliminating your own suffering in your life. And that, guys, man, that means everything. That is everything for us. So I just wanted to let you know kind of what was coming down the pike. I do want to get right into talking about something that is rarely discussed, if at all, in infertility circles, and that's burnout. We're seeing a lot of information coming out around the effects of burnout, certainly more than ever over the past 5 to 10 years. We saw a host of information come out around burnout as it pertained to COVID-19 pandemic, working from home, things like that. So why don't we ever hear anything about infertility burnout? Well, that's because if infertility is rarely discussed outside of the infertility community, then it stands to reason that some of the facets of infertility wouldn't be discussed or even acknowledged, right? Areas like trauma, grief, loss, and of course, burnout. We talk about burnout in the workplace all the time. That's where most of the research around burnout has been conducted. You can do an Amazon search for burnout and pull up no less than 20 pages of resources, books, self-help, stuff like that, referring to burnout and resiliency. Burnout is now regularly used in our cultural vernacular. I'm kind of harping on this point because I want to make sure it is understood that it took us years to begin acknowledging what the symptoms of burnout were, to name it, and to begin really researching it and ways to mitigate, recover from, or avoid the potential entirely. When I was working on my master's in social work, and this was over a decade ago, we had really just started talking about things like compassion fatigue, which although is similar aspects to burnout, it's not exactly the same thing. But the point is that it had really just been started to research 5 years before that. Usually when we're learning about something, it comes out in academic research and it kind of stays there for several years as multiple people research it and run experiments and things like that. So it takes a while to go from academic literature to cultural understanding, right? This takes sometimes decades to really understand. As such, that means that simply because something isn't acknowledged, named, and doesn't have dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles written about it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Burnout was real long before we ever called it that, long before it was ever acknowledged. I believe infertility burnout is just as real. It's just like a niche aspect of burnout. Now, the hallmark signs and symptoms of burnout, according to the World Health Organization, and this was in June of 2019, are a feeling of depletion of energy or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job or feeling negatively towards one's career, and reduced professional productivity. Now, remember, at the beginning, I said that most of the research around burnout has to do with your career. So that's why it's specific to that in that definition. These are what are commonly associated with burnout and what are normally discussed and acknowledged in research. So here's my version of the signs and symptoms for infertility burnout. Feeling a depletion of energy/exhaustion. That sounds familiar, right? Increased mental distance from trying to conceive or fertility treatments, or feeling negatively towards trying to conceive and fertility treatments. Reduced personal productivity. Whatever it is, the things that you've always loved to do, an inability to focus at work, things like that. How many of you can relate to this? Now, I know most of you listen to this in your car, so don't raise your hand and risk crashing, because I think every single person who has ever been on any amount of time of a fertility journey would raise their hand. I know I can, and I can point to many different points in our 9-year journey where I have felt this. Experiencing infertility takes a toll on mental health as a couple and as an individual. We often find ourselves in a constant state of disappointment, anger, exhaustion, loss of interest, social isolation, despair, resentment. I mean, the cornucopia of emotions is kind of endless. And those, my gorgeous friends, are the signs of burnout. Let me take a quick second and quickly delineate the difference between burnout and stress. It can be difficult to differentiate between burnout and stress, which I think is a very common thing. Stress is generally tied to something specific, a deadline, a project, or a cycle. You might be anxious or stressed about starting stims or a transfer or waiting test results. Completely normal, and I would offer pretty expected for our journeys. Not inevitable, but expected. However, if you dread when you walk into your clinic, if you feel completely detached from your current or upcoming cycle, or you're telling yourself that treatment has become impossible or useless, you are likely nearing or are at burnout. Burnout is a byproduct of the emotional weight of any given experience. Infertility, better or worse, provides us plenty of opportunities for those experiences. Now, if you listen to me for any amount of time, you know that I do believe very strongly that our thoughts create our feelings. This is a basic tenet of my coaching practice, the think, feel, do cycle, right? Now, that does not mean that I believe that burnout is solely created in our thinking. I don't believe that one day you start thinking thoughts and boom, you're in burnout. Not at all. Burnout in most cases is a gradual process. I believe that the trauma that we experience, both big T and little t traumas, the social isolation that many of us experience, let's just say all the craptastic aspects of infertility, create this gradual buildup towards burnout. When you couple that with our cultural expectation that we should feel shiny and happy all of the time, and if we don't feel that way, then we're doing something wrong, our resistance and avoidance of emotions, seriously, it's a wonder how any of us go through an infertility journey not feeling burnt out. I guess that's hyperbole because every woman that I've ever spoke to has shown signs of burnout. I do believe, and I'll talk about it more in part 2 of this episode, the continuation, that our thinking can perpetuate and even exacerbate burnout. One of the most common aspects of burnout that I see in my clients or on Facebook message boards, anywhere on social media, is that when we experience the symptoms of burnout, we all too often equate our emotional state to not handling things well. If we're experiencing the symptom of detachment or depersonalization or emotional distancing, we often make that mean that we don't want it enough or that we're not doing something right. Essentially, we begin experiencing the symptoms of burnout and then we shame ourselves. I mean, the lengths that we will go to beat the crap out of ourselves is actually truly quite impressive. Like, we can make anything, just about anything, mean something terrible about ourselves. This is just how our brains are wired. So doing that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong or that anything has gone wrong. It's just what happens. Now, I mentioned earlier that I believe our thinking can exacerbate burnout, and this is one of the ways. When we beat the crap out of ourselves for quote unquote not handling things well, or when we should all over ourselves for how we think we should be handling things, we end up feeling worse. And by the way, if that is you, I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about what handling it well even looks like. It's a really subjective phrase, but we treat it like it's objective. Like there's a specific rote or universal way to handle things. Whenever I ask my clients what that means, usually what I hear is something like, you just get back up. It's almost like the pick yourself up, dust yourself up, suck it up, buck up, put your big girl panties on, right? I mean, these are all phrases that I've heard time and time again. And honestly, I've probably said to myself at many different points in my life. But for me, there are two things here. One, handling things well is such an ambiguous phrase. I do believe specificity is where we can combat a lot of our fears, our anxieties, and our judgments. And number two, these phrases don't really allow for any grieving, mourning, or really allowing anything to be human, your human experience. Now, I know that as a community, as a society, grief and mourning is not something we openly discuss or acknowledge. If anything, it's mostly shied away from or outright ignored. But it is a very, very human thing. It is an emotional experience just like anything else. It deserves the time and opportunity to be felt and experienced. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time next week talking about how we can get out of burnout. But for now, what I really want to drive home for you is the starting point for nearly all of the things that I talk about: awareness and compassion. Being aware that burnout is a possibility, right? You don't need to diagnose yourself. You don't need to pathologize anything, but being open to the idea that if you're experiencing anything that I've talked about in this episode or something else that you're experiencing that's somewhere in the vicinity of what we've talked about, then it is entirely possible that you are experiencing burnout. Just opening yourself up to the possibility of it being something that doesn't mean that you're broken or that you're doing something wrong, I got to tell you, that's going to feel so different. It doesn't take away from what you're experiencing. There's no magic switch that is flipped and all of a sudden your burnout is gone. No, but it can change your experience of it. You may take that awareness and you pile on, like pile on compassion. Compassion, compassion, compassion. I feel like at some point I'm going to launch some merch that just has compassion, compassion, compassion everywhere. You know that one of my favorite things in the world is to humanize these experiences for you guys. Burnout is a human experience. Infertility is really, really effing hard. IVF is really, really effing hard. You are doing an amazing job handling some really hard shit. There is no manual for how to handle infertility or how to handle IVF. They are both incredibly individual experiences. So if there's no manual, then there's no objective way that you can possibly be doing it right or wrong. Crying isn't wrong, even if it's in the middle of a family get-together, in a church pew, at work, whenever or wherever. It's not wrong. Now, you might choose to compose yourself based on the situation and then come back to it when you're feeling more comfortable, but that's different from not allowing yourself the opportunity to feel the emotion, period. Sad. Being sad isn't wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. Now, I will add one final caveat before I close out this episode. I would be completely remiss if we did not address depression. If you feel like you cannot get out of bed, go to work, or if things that are a huge struggle for you, I implore you, contact your primary care doctor, your fertility doctor, your OBGYN, whomever you feel most comfortable with, and talk to them. If you feel like you are in danger of hurting yourself or anyone else, please call the emergency services line for whatever country you live in. In the US, we have 911 or the suicide prevention hotline. The only thing, and I mean the only thing I care about, is your safety. The most important thing we can do is safeguard ourselves from burnout by recognizing the signs and taking steps to minimize or reverse your burnout, which is what we're going to be talking about next week. Okay, that is what I have for you, my friends. I will talk to you next week. Have a beautiful week. Bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.